what do we mean when we say change one thing? Where did that come from?
When I was a new instructor with almost no pedagogy training, I just did what my faculty, my professors had done with me, lectured in the same ways, used stuff I had seen that I thought worked. That was a pretty small subset of the kinds of things you can do as a professor. And I felt like what I was mostly doing was lecturing with a tiny bit of discussion, some question and answers. And I started going to professional development events, teaching seminars and things in order to improve how I taught, would get all excited and come away thinking, okay, I am going to do this. I'm going to try this thing. And then get back to my office and try to figure out how to incorporate those ideas into my teaching. And it was just overwhelming. The problem was that it took expertise I didn't have. It took skills I did not have to incorporate the kinds of things I was hearing into my teaching. That, after many frustrations, probably 10 or more professional development things where I learned about different aspects of teaching, I had to figure out some way to make some changes that weren't going to be try and do the big thing all at once. Some of them didn't seem that big. I mean, some of them were actually pretty small things, but they were still overwhelming to me. And what I found was if I decided to just change one thing, I would think about what's the core of this, or what is something easy I can do that maybe doesn't meet what they're after in this particular exercise for this particular technique, but it at least gets me started. And that's where I started thinking about, okay, I want to change just one thing because I can handle one change at a time. I can't completely revamp the way I teach all at once. And sometimes those change one things where I'm going to try it out with one student. If it's some in-class exercise I heard about, I'm going to try it out with one student in my office when they're there for office hours. Or, yeah, they have in mind changing an entire lecture or maybe an entire course, but I'm going to see if I can figure out some way to do it for just a minute, just to see what happens and feel what it's like. And that pattern of changing one thing is what has led me eventually to change a lot of things and try a lot of ideas in my teaching. Many of them have not worked. Some of them are just not, they're not in my comfort zone. They're not in my capacity to do. But in the process of trying to change one thing in many, many different ways, I found things that did work. And that's where I got started thinking about it as change one thing. And in talking with lots of other teachers, I realized that's a huge barrier for most of us.
Yeah, you're totally right. And that's, I think that's one reason that your session at the May Symposium resonated with so many people is because they could hear their own experience in the story that you shared. So you presented about this idea of change one thing, and we got a ton of feedback, very positive feedback about how they wanted a longer session from the biology professor and a bigger room for the biology professor. Some of them actually, knew your name, and others just referred to you as the biology professor. So that is, in looking at that data, that's where STLI said, hey, this thing has some legs. Let's see if we can get the word out to a broader audience about the power of change one thing. So our goal with this podcast is not only to capture the hard-won lessons that you've learned about the activities and the changes that really did work with your students, but also to hear the voices of some other experts here on campus who have had success with this change one thing idea. So we're going to ignore the duds. You don't really have to share those unless they are, important to the story of how you landed on something that did work. But if you could just kind of preview for us, what are some of the successful change one thing strategies that we're going to be talking about in these episodes?
I'll start with some of the change one things that were the easiest to do and had the biggest impact for the least amount of work. The 8-second rule, pausing for 8 seconds after you ask a question, putting something into each lecture that is fun just for me, that gets me excited to give the lecture or the discussion or whatever it is, So one fun thing, change one thing problems, in which you take something you have taught to students and you ask them to change one thing in it, or you give them one change and you ask them to predict what would be different in this system or this novel or this historical event or this biological process if you change that one thing. Choose an outcome. How can you make it happen? Again, in any discipline, if you wanted things to come out differently in economics or history or biology or physics, what could you change in order to possibly get that different outcome? Think, engage, explain was my variant of the think, pair, share, which is really well known and works really well, but it was hard for me to jump straight into think, pair, share. And think, engage, explain to me was a lot simpler, so it was my simpler version of the same thing. Another one, diagnosing student learning issues, not in the sense of learning disabilities, but in the sense of what are they doing in their studying that is getting in the way of their learning. And over time, I wound up trying additional questions, one new question at a time, that helped me help students discover, why is my studying not working the way I want it to? Drawing to learn, in which students sketch out in minimalist fashion the fastest possible sketch to catch the idea, and then practice those sketches to develop memory and use them for model-based reasoning. Again, model-based reasoning and sketching can work in any discipline.
So we hope you feel inspired to go out and change one thing in your teaching, and we want to hear from you. So please email us at stli@wm.edu. That's STLI@wm.edu if you would like to make an appearance here in Studio 36 or virtually in our virtual podcasting studio.